Hi, everybody. So because you're a participant in a webinar, your video and audio aren't on. So you don't actually need to worry about muting yourself, Sean. And I'll hand it off to Maticus.
Thanks, Shay. Hi, everyone. My name is Maticus Adams. I'm the Harm Reduction Programs Coordinator at Max Ottawa. I want to say hello to all of our international guests as well. And before we start any meeting, we like to do a land acknowledgement. And just because it's like typically like a North American thing, I just wanted to make sure that we explain what that was before we dive into it. So a land acknowledgement was, the idea of a land acknowledgement was inspired by the 94 recommended calls to action contained in the Truth and Reconciliation Committee of Canada, now known as the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. And land acknowledgements are a necessary step forward, honoring the original occupants of a place. They also help Canadians recognize and respect Indigenous peoples' inherent kinship beliefs when it comes to the land, especially since those beliefs were restricted for so long. So with that being said, because I'm from Ottawa, we like to say that with gratitude and respect, we acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Today, this land is home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work in this territory. We also have many people joining us from across Turtle Island, which others may know as North America. I also have with me is James Demers, who's going to be my co-presenter. James is actually my boss. He's the executive director at Max Ottawa. His career includes a focus on EDI education from a queer lens, implemented across a variety of sectors, including healthcare, social services, tech, and government policy development. Active for many years in arts and culture work, James is also a drag performer, show producer, public speaker, trans advocate, and athlete in his spare time. So that's going to be fun there. My first presentation working with my boss, so bear with me a little bit. So just for those who, I guess is their first time joining us with Stimulus, the Stimulus program is a collaboration of the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition and the Canadian Association of People Who Use Drugs. Welcome to everyone to the Make It Queer Intro to Harm Reduction through a gender and sexual diversity lens. And then we do have a few planning committee members who are helping out in the background who will give us a wave. So we have Nick, who is doing simultaneous French and English interpretation. Thanks, Nick. We have Courtney, who will be watching the chat. We have Anne-Marie, who will be watching the Q&A. And we have the fabulous Shay doing the background tech. We do also, so a bit of housekeeping before we get started. Today is also World Hepatitis Day. And if I encourage you, if you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat, but including your pronouns and where you are from. And just to let you know, we have over 380 people registered for this event. A few more things to go over. So we are using the hashtag StimulusConnect. We welcome all questions in the chat in either French or English. Questions for the panelists can go in the Q&A. And if it's a question that you also want answered that someone else has written, just upvote it. And that way it'll get pushed up to the top of the questions for us at the end of the presentation. This event is being recorded and will be available on the Stimulus website in the future. We are also on Facebook Live right now. If you are having any problems with the sound going in and out, turn off the oral interpretation when you do not need it. The Stimulus webinar webpage has 35 resources thus far, and if we identify more today, we will add those in. The website links will be in the chat. And we do also want to take a minute to shout out all of the folks who are joining us from around the world. So we have the Burundi Association of People Who Use Drugs. We have folks from Antigua and Barbuda. We have folks from Ghana, India, Ireland, Mexico, Portugal, Spain, Thailand, the USA, and the Ukraine. So that is all of the preamble stuff. Let me just share my screen here and get started on. So I'll be presenting the first part. My presentation will be focused on the idea of cultural capacity or cultural competency, what it is and what we do to get to become more culturally competent. So that's going to be kind of like getting us to the point of conversation about like why we should be culturally competent and how we get there. And then James will go into more of a deep dive onto like a 2S LGBTQIA plus community 101. So give me 1 sec here. All right. So yeah, as I said, it's called Keeping It Queer. And then we're talking, this is cultural competency for working with 2S LGBTQIA plus community members. I already introduced myself. So this is the agenda. So normally we do a land acknowledgement. We've already done that. I'm going to talk a bit about Max Ottawa, just so you know what the organization is that I work for. We have a couple of objectives for this. Then we're going to go into cultural competency, and then we have some final takeaways before we move on to James's presentation. So yeah, land acknowledgement, we already did that. A little bit about Max Ottawa. So Max Ottawa is the first Guys into Guys standalone organization in Ontario. Max focuses on maximizing the health and wellness of gay, bisexual, two-spirit, queer, and other guys into guys, both cis and trans. And we welcome all individuals who identify with, represented by, or feel at home at least some of the time with the term guys into guys. We also offer mental health, sexual health, harm reduction, and social health programming. And there are about 1.3 million people in the area that Max operates in, being the Champlain-Lynn and Gatineau. So it's Ottawa, the area around Ottawa, and Gatineau. So my objectives for this part of the presentation is we want to understand what cultural competency is, establish why cultural competency is important, and discuss 3 ways to become more culturally competent. So cultural competency, talk about it a lot. And I mean, if you had a nickel for every time you're going to hear me say it in the next 45 minutes, you'd be very, very wealthy, but it's going to come up quite a bit. But yeah, what is cultural competency? Well, cultural competency is the ability to understand, communicate with, and effectively interact with people across cultures. Cultural competency encompasses being aware of one's own worldview and developing positive attitudes towards cultural differences. It also involves policies and procedures that reflect and incorporate the views, values, and beliefs of people from other cultures that you are looking to work with. Sounds like a very big idea. It is fairly complicated, but at the basic structure, we're gonna go into each part of that. Cultural competency as a concept exists in many different areas of life, including healthcare, harm reduction, even things like fashion, advertising, and media, and more. The list goes on. Cultural competency is made up of a lot of little things too that members of the same cultural community understand almost innately. These types of things are often only learned by living in the community and learning from community members. For example, if you film a movie in Canada, but set it in the United States, and people can see bagged milk, because in Canada, we sell milk in bags, people will know that that's not actually set in the United States, because that's a cultural thing. In Canada, we have bagged milk. In the States, they don't. So it's like these little things that oftentimes research won't teach you. You need someone who's grew up there or who's been part of that culture to know these things. So that's that's how nuanced and how tiny the details can be that make something culturally competent versus not. Something as simple as whether the milk is in a bag or not can be the determiner of whether or not this is accurate or not, or whether or not it's competent to the culture that you're trying to talk to. So I do love this part because we're going to look at some 3 examples that show why cultural competency is important. I have a background in business and I liked marketing. And so these are some examples of where marketing didn't do the work of getting their cultural competency and learning about the cultures that they wanted to work with, and maybe some ways that they kind of flubbed up a little bit. So it can be really different, especially if you're working between languages. So when Coca-Cola decided that it wanted to start selling in China, they wanted to use a name that sounded like the words Coca-Cola. It's part of their brand. The problem is that the characters that made those sounds roughly translated to the bite the wax tadpole. So eventually they changed their characters to mean happiness in the mouth, because the name, having it sound like Coca-Cola, wasn't as important as having something that meant something that people would understand as being pleasurable. Because I can't imagine biting a wax tadpole to be something that's very fun or something that would make me want to buy it. Sometimes it's not lost in translation. So sometimes it's not necessarily about the difference between languages. So this is an Electrolux vacuum cleaner. The Swedish company Electrolux wanted to introduce their vacuums to the US and thought that they had the best slogan ever. It was translated, grammatically correct, but they didn't understand American culture very well. So, because their slogan was, "Nothing sucks like an Electrolux." Technically correct, but not knowing that the word sucks means something different in American culture meant that that didn't exactly say what they wanted it to say. It's also not only words, but sometimes pictures can be culturally incompetent. So here is some Gerber baby food. When Gerber decided to market its baby food in Africa, they used their usual packaging with the cute little baby on the label. Unfortunately, no one there was aware, like nobody at Gerber was aware that in some African countries, folks understand that the images on the label actually tell you what's inside the container, not who it's for. So it really redefined the term baby food, because they didn't have anybody who knew that that was not culturally correct there. These can be pretty embarrassing mistakes to make. And we can put effort into learning about the cultures of people we want to work with in order to avoid these kinds of situations. When it comes to healthcare or harm reduction, being culturally competent can be the difference between your community members trusting you and getting treatment, or saying nothing and suffering in silence. So some things that I've heard people say when I have this conversation about cultural competency is like, well, I feel like I'm culturally aware. Isn't that enough? Or I'm already sensitive to other people's culture, so I'm good to go, right? You may have heard these terms before: cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, and cultural competency, but what's the difference with them? I should also point out that there is some, I've heard from people in academia that the word cultural competency is sort of being phased out. They're moving into something else. For the time being, we'll continue using cultural competency, but it's apparently in academia, they're starting to move away from the term cultural competency. But yeah, we're going to dive into the difference between awareness, sensitivity, and competency. So cultural awareness is the ability to reflect on and identify your own cultural views, values, and attitudes. This gives you your frame of reference to help you relate to others. So cultural awareness is the awareness of your own culture. It's your frame of reference. Cultural sensitivity is the awareness of the similarities and differences between your views, values, and attitudes and those of others. This is important when you're building relationships and helps you recognize how your service might be received by others. So sensitivity is knowing that my culture is different than your culture. So that's being sensitive, is just knowing that your experience is different than mine. Cultural competency is the ability to understand, communicate with, and effectively interact with people across cultures. So it encompasses being aware of your own worldview, so really understanding your frame of reference, developing positive attitudes towards cultural differences, so basically understanding yourself, having a positive attitude and an awareness of other people's cultures, so the differences between us, gaining knowledge of different cultural practices and worldviews, and applying them to policies and procedures. So cultural competency at the end is sort of all of these things together, because you can't be culturally competent if you don't understand your own frame of reference, and you can't be culturally competent if you don't understand that there's a difference between my culture and your culture. And another big part of it is that you need to learn about the other cultures that you want to work with. And then you want to be able to take what you've learned and then apply it to how you function, how you operate. Because if your organization doesn't apply the knowledge that's gained, then you're not really becoming culturally competent. You just are gaining knowledge. It has to translate into something that actually happens. So this is sort of a visual representation of that, where it's the cultural competency is the whole circle, and they're made up of the parts, the sensitivity, the awareness, and the policies, and also policies and learning. So now that we have now that we have discussed what cultural competency is, how do we become culturally competent? And how do we implement policies and procedures to make our work more culturally competent? Well, we're going to discuss 3 ways to work towards making our work more culturally competent. So we're looking at doing the homework, participating in training, and working with the community. Doing the homework, start at the beginning. A Google search can be the start of your cultural competency journey. It's a great place to just get your foundation, get some groundwork in. You want to look for things like articles, journals, books written by members of the community, videos, documentaries, TV shows, movies, interviews about the community, again, ideally produced by community members. And if possible, visit or participate in public events or spaces run by and for the community you want to learn about. It's good that one of the key things through all of this is that they're by the members of the community, because if you want to work with them and you want to learn about them, it's best to learn from folks who are already in the community as opposed to learning from observers of the community. That's a bit more academic. If you're looking to actually be on the ground floor and working with folks, lived experience plays a really big part in that. The other thing is that there is a limit to what Google can teach us. Preliminary research is a good place to start and will give you a good foundation about the community that you are learning about, but it should not be the end of your journey. And rarely Google will teach you everything you need to know in order to be able to work competently with someone else, with another cultural group. So the second one that we can do is participate in training. This one's easy. You're already doing it. See how fast that was? We already got to this one. You want to keep a lookout for seminars, workshops, courses, or lectures on working with the specific communities you are looking to or may already work with. You can also reach out to consultants or organizations that work with those other communities, which can help bring in more localized knowledge to you and your organization. So if you're doing your research and then you're like, oh, I'd love to learn more, find organizations that work with the communities that you want to work with and reach out to them. Because if they can't provide you with cultural competency training or be able to do consultations, at the very least, they might be able to connect you with someone else that can. So I think that it's a really important thing to reach out to folks who work and are in the communities that you're looking to work with. If you can, take trainings with your colleagues. It will help give you someone in your workplace to help advocate for change, or it'll even just give you someone else to discuss your new knowledge with afterwards. So having someone else in your organization take trainings with you whenever possible can be a really good support for you if you're trying to make changes. And as I said, it gives you that space to reinforce what you've learned and have discussions about it, about what you've learned and how you can implement it in your work, in your organization. The last one is working with the community. So there's no better way to learn about how to serve the community than to ask them what they need or how to serve them. This can mean things like a needs assessment, so interviews with community members, surveys, focus groups, so getting a group of community members together and asking them and asking them for feedback, and advisory committees. So a long-standing relationship with a group of individuals from a community that you want to work with that can provide ongoing feedback, which is really great if you're looking to do continual work with the same group or the same cultural community. So as an example of building our own cultural competency, Max has done some work at building trust with the party and play community in Ottawa. Party and play, for those not familiar, is a commonly used term for sexualized substance use amongst queer men. Also referred to as chemsex, depending on where you are in the world. It kind of varies back and forth between P&P or party and play and chemsex. But that's the community that Max has specifically done a fair amount of work with. And that's the ones that I'm going to be talking about of how we've gone to work with the P&P community here. So we have a safer partying advisory committee. We had our spill the tea events, and we have a harm reduction dispensing program. So our safer partying advisory committee, so it's an advisory committee comprised of guys who identify as members of the P&P community. They help us ensure we are working competently to meet the needs of the P&P community and avoid stigmatizing drug use. They actually helped create the branding for our Spill the Tea events and continue to help us work towards more programming for guys at P&P. We meet with them every quarter at the very least. They have, we sit down, I go over what our programming looks like, what our events are coming up, and then I get feedback from them as to where there are gaps or where trends are changing or where new needs are arising, especially as COVID was a thing, learning how or hearing from them about digital spaces versus in-person spaces was a really important way for us to kind of build our programming because they had like on the ground knowledge of what was going on in the community. Our Spill the Tea was a series of bar nights featuring drag performers from Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto, and from RuPaul's Drag Race. The night included harm reduction and entertainment and tried to start a conversation around P&P in Ottawa. So we made very large scale events that publicly announced that we were looking to talk about P&P. For the folks that didn't come to us through our advisory committee or through any of the focus groups that had happened before that, as we were leading up to this project, this was our grand statement that Max was here for guys who P&P. So we did the 3 series through the course of 1 year. They were very large, well attended, and they were that mix of edutainment. So a little bit of education and a little bit of entertainment. And then our harm reduction dispensing program, which we lovingly refer to as T2Go. The quick little thing is that because P&P often involves crystal meth, which they refer to as T. And then we have used the linkage between that and the queer cultural recognition of the term tea, meaning truth, or like spilling the tea as in saying something that is true. And kind of you have used that as part of the branding as a way to speak to queer guys who use meth in order, because these were keywords or these are key ideas that they would connect with. So that's why you see the word T come up quite a bit in these. But yeah, our T2Go program started in August of 2020. We dispense safer sex, safer partying, which is what we refer to as the safer substance use stuff. Again, that was from our safer partying advisory committee, that they would say that safer partying equipment. So that's the safer substance use and safer hormone injection supplies. And that one's going to be important because we're going to bring that one up again. So we did this in order to make sure that we were providing access to materials for guys and to guys, both cis and trans, in a culturally competent way, providing discretion where needed and carrying the materials that they wanted. So we have kits that are made that are party kits, and they include things, we have a inhalation and an injection party kit. They include things like snorting straws, they include things like fisting gloves, condoms, lube, and also a variety of inhalation and injection supplies in the respective kits. And those were built in partnership with our Safer Partying Advisory Committee. They kind of told us what we should put in these party kits. So we built them around that. The other thing too is that because we want to respect the need for discretion for queer folks who consume substances, or for anybody who's looking to get sexual health supplies or hormone injection supplies, we deliver stuff anonymously to folks' house. We can mail it to them, or they can pick it up, and all of the pickup stuff is done anonymously. So everything is, if someone places an order through our online website, we just fill the order, put an order number on it, and then they can pick it up using the order number. So they don't have to reveal what's in the packaging. They can very discreetly get their orders filled and get the supplies that they need, because that was identified as a big issue and as a big barrier to accessing harm reduction programs. We decided that we wanted to build in these different routes of access because it was what our community needed. An interesting thing to notice from our program respondents, about 54% of them identify as trans and non-binary. So one of the key reasons we were able to reach these folks is because we promote that we have hormone injection supplies, which are key search terms that folks will be looking for if they're looking to get hormone injection supplies. And they might not traditionally think to look for a harm reduction program, but if they type in hormone injection supplies, we will come up. And one of the things that is interesting about it is that if you have access to needle tips, the exchangeable needle tips in various gauges and lengths, and 1 or 3 mil syringe barrels, you can offer hormone injection supplies in your harm reduction programs, because those are the things that they're looking for, aside from sharps containers, alcohol swabs, those kind of other things that come with injection supplies. But that's all it takes. And one of the things that I've noticed, because we have people that contact us from across Canada asking for programs like ours. When I go do some searching around in their cities or their regions, a lot of their harm reduction programs carry all the same material that we do. We just promote it differently. So it's this thing where we have to take an extra step and realize that folks weren't looking for harm reduction programs when they wanted their hormone injection supplies. So we had to make sure we included hormone injection in our marketing, in our language, so that folks would find us, because we carry the stuff that they're looking for. And a lot of programs do, they just don't advertise it. Another thing that we did too was we were working with trans and non-binary folks, and we were learning about how hormone injection works and learning what supplies they needed and wanted, and then ways around barriers for them accessing supplies. And that's like a really big important part, because that was what helped us make a program that had such a high uptake from trans and non-binary folks. And some of the barriers may have been they didn't want to come out as trans or non-binary when accessing harm reduction supplies. So being able to order supplies online, they don't have to. They can use an alias. If they want to have it mailed to them, they just put a mailing address and we just pack their order and ship it to them. So learning from them, talking to them was one of the ways that we managed to make this program something that really seems to work for trans and non-binary folks looking for hormone injection supplies. And by extension, sometimes, because there are not trans and non-binary folks who party or who P&P, or maybe looking for sexual health supplies as well, they've already established a relationship with us because they know they can get their hormone injection supplies. So sometimes you'll get hormone injection supplies, and then you'll get orders later on that are hormone injection supplies, and then say for sex supplies.
Des commandes d'équipements pour l'injection d'hormones, et par la suite vont aussi commander du matériel de réduction des méfaits.
And not really bother them too much with questions, or they feel safe coming to you for supplies. And eventually, hopefully, they'll feel comfortable coming back here for service if they need services. So we have explored 3 ways to become culturally competent. So doing the homework, participating in trainings, and working with the community. And some of the ways that Max has worked to build trust with the P&P community and our trans and non-binary community members. So what is something that your organization could do right now to start improving your cultural competency and relationship with trans and non-binary folks? This one's pretty easy. It's called, I titled it Making Space for Self-Identification. So I'm going to tell you a little story about a time I worked in a tattoo shop. So I was the body piercer, and I had a conversation. I'd had a couple of clients come through that were trans and non-binary, and they had there was this sort of uncomfortableness sometimes when someone was misgendered, or someone used the wrong pronouns when addressing them. And after a couple of instances of that, I was talking with some of the other artists, and we had discussed the idea of putting on our consent forms, because we have to have everyone sign a consent form when they get work, putting a chosen name and preferred pronoun. That way we could address them starting right off the bat with pronouns that they're comfortable with, and with a chosen name that they prefer us to use, as opposed if they don't use their like the name that appears on their IDs. And there was a bit of pushback back and forth. There was this idea of, well, should we ask them what their gender identity is as opposed to just their pronouns? And I had said, if someone comes in and says, I'm agender, or I'm neutois, or I'm a demigirl, like I identify as a demigirl, do you know how to address them? And the artists were like, no. And I said, okay, so would it just be easier to ask what their pronouns are? And they said, okay, well, yeah, I guess when you look at it that way, it would just be easier to ask what their pronouns are. And I said, then why don't we try that out? And we did that. And we had once we started doing it, we got quite a reputation for it. And I've had multiple clients come back through that process. And they said that they came back to us because we asked on the consent form, and because it was written down on this form, they never were addressed with anything other than what was in the consent form. That's what we used to treat. Their chosen name was what they were put into our booking systems with. They were used if we were emailing them or calling them, and their pronouns are what we used going forward. And then we got into the habit of our counter staff, when somebody would come in and it was our first time working with a client, they would come to us, they would say, oh, just for example, they'd be like, oh, hello, just to let you know, your client Shannon is here, and she uses she, her pronouns. And so that way, from the beginning, we were able to build a relationship with trans and non-binary clients, knowing that they could come to us and we would respect their pronouns, their chosen names, and they would feel safe and comfortable getting services from us. It was a really cool thing that we got to do, and it was really fun to get to be able to build those relationships. And we learned a lot about the community as we were working through this. And as we were changing this way, we got kind of known as being like the safe tattoo shop in the city for like queer folks in general, because other people saw that as, if they weren't trans or non-binary, but if they were other queer individuals and they saw the pronouns on there, they sort of could kind of link that and say, well, if they're asking for pronouns, they're probably okay with queer people in general. And then the shop also doubled down and did like a fundraiser for a local queer organization to really like hammer home that this was like a safe space for queer people. And that was all it took. All we had to do was provide a space for a chosen name and provide a space for a pronoun and let them identify themselves. It was the simplest solution and provided so much safety and security for the clients that came in, that it was one of like the simplest things. And it was weird to look back on it and say that there was even an argument about it, because it was so simple. It was so easy to do. Yeah, so that's just reiterating that just chosen name and pronouns on intake forms. And that could be translated to other services if you have forms that folks have to fill out when they start doing services with you. Because one of the things that comes with it too is that writing it down on a form is a lot easier than expecting someone to say to your face, or to say during a conversation, to come out as either a queer person, like as gay or bi, or to come out as trans or non-binary. That can be a lot more stress inducing than filling it on a form. And even on a form, they might not want to fill it out if you give them a space to do that. Some people don't, but leaving the space there is important, because the folks that need it will use it, and the folks that don't won't. And like the three things that we really learned from this was that we had to make space for them to self-identify, but we also had to get into the habit of checking. So all the counter staff had to get into the habit of double checking the pronouns. And that's why part of that was that the counter staff would come to tell us that our client was here. This was their name. This was their pronoun, so that they were checking. And then whatever the pronouns were provided, we used. And it wasn't about understanding what their identity was. And it wasn't about understanding what their sexuality was or why their name was different than the name on their ID. It was just respecting what they told us. If their name was X and they used they, them pronouns, we called them X and we used they, them pronouns. It was very, very simple. But that's sort of kind of wrapping everything up. We're going to go through like final takeaways, which are just, if there's anything to remember from this presentation, it's these couple of things. So for the cultural awareness and for the breakdown of cultural awareness, sensitivity, and competency, just remember awareness is yourself, sensitivity is the differences between you and me, and competency is being able to take my frame of reference, the differences between us, learn about the differences between us, and then apply those differences and those needs for different cultures that you learn about into policies and procedures and take them into your work. If you want to become more culturally competent, the three ways to do it is to do your homework, participate in training, and work with the community. And my final thought, and I know I kind of went in on it a couple times during the story about working at the tattoo shop, is that it is super easy to respect someone, even if it might be hard to understand them. Just because somebody has a gender identity that you don't understand, it doesn't make it, like, just because it's hard to not to understand their gender identity doesn't mean that it's hard to respect their pronouns. Because if someone tells you to identify this way, that's all you have to do, is just say, okay, that's the pronouns that we'll use going forward. But that's all for me. And thank you so much for sitting through my cultural competency introduction. But I think I'm handing it off to Shay for the next part.
I am. Thank you, Maticus. I'm just going to launch the poll. As you know, when you are funded by the government, you sometimes need to gather some basic data. That's what we're doing. In addition, we have added one question that is for us to check to see where our diversity is at from the population of people who are in here. So you don't have to answer this question. It's entirely anonymous. And after James speaks, I'm going to share the results with you. So I'm going to open up the poll now. And as James sorts out slides and stuff, we'll have that time to put it up. And so it'll be up for about 3 minutes or so. Thanks, everyone. Lots of chat, Maticus. It was amazing.
I kept seeing the numbers, like the chat numbers go up, and I just didn't want to get distracted because I knew if I opened it and started reading it, I was going to lose my place.
Indeed, indeed. All right. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Welcome. Thank you so much, Matt. I appreciate it. So now we're going to go into a little bit more detail. Now I've titled this presentation LGBTQ 2S LGBTQ 101. I want to acknowledge off the bat that as a queer person and as somebody who's been an activist for a while, we know that the acronym is long and that it involves a lot of context. And so we're actually going to get to explore that context today, which I'm really looking forward to doing with all of you. So let's get into this. As I mentioned at the top, my name is James Demers. My pronouns are he, him. I am actually coming to you from Tree 7 territory. So I'm not quite in Ottawa yet. I'm getting there. I'm out here in Mohkinstsis, also known as Calgary. So this is the traditional territory for us here of the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Kainai, the Piikani, the Stoney Nakoda, the Wesley, Bearspaw, and Chiniki First Nations, and the Métis region number 3. And we are fundamentally very, very lucky to get to learn from Indigenous communities in the worlds around us. Fundamentally, as LGBT people, pre-colonization introduced a much more variety in the ways in which we can connect to the land around us and we can build community with each other. And so as Canadians, and personally as a settler, it's important that we talk about our connections to Indigenous folks, particularly our neighbors right now. And so I like to take the opportunity to do that. Thanks, Nick. You can definitely do that. So let's start here. So let's start at the beginning. So gender identity, expression, and sex as a legal category. And now I know we have quite a few international guests here, so I'm going to try to make context around how this currently operates where we are, and it may operate differently where you are. So let's start with sex assigned at birth. So sex assigned at birth in Canada, for example, is a legal category. We call it sex assigned at birth because sex is a legal designation that is assigned to you at birth by a doctor. So this is the legal designation that is currently placed on birth certificates. So sex assigned at birth is sex, the legal category, applied to folks when they are born, which is to say that we actually have no idea what an individual's, we have no idea what an individual's gender identity is, which we will get to in a second. But right now in Canada, there are 3 legal categories that encompass sex: F for female, M for male, and X for non-binary. Now, we will very likely live in a Canada very soon where sex assigned at birth will no longer be something that we add to birth certificates, which will change this conversation for all of us significantly. The reason for that is that we also we used to put father's occupation on birth certificates up until the 1950s. And so as we reevaluate the data that is necessary for us to collect at different points in our lives, this may be an update that is coming to all of us in the next 10 or so years. But right now, sex is a legal category. It refers to a physical determination from a doctor based on our existing medical structure. Now, let's go to gender identity. Gender identity is each person's individual experience of their gender. It's their sense of being a man, a woman, or non-binary. Now, gender identity is your software. It's the way that your brain's wired. In the same way that you know that you like cilantro and hate horror movies, and those are permanent, immutable facts about who you are, gender identity is the same. It is how our brains are wired. It tells us who we are. Now, how people in the outside world, our community members, our coworkers, see our gender is through a category called gender expression. So this is a person's gender presentation, mannerisms, behaviors, interest, or appearance, and it is associated specifically with gender in a particular cultural context. Now, this is really quite important because we attribute gender to objects in ways now that we previously didn't historically. So for example, wigs and high heels were an invention of men's fashion in the 1600s in France. Now, we would consider that way of using gender expression very different now. And so as an example, what's important to understand here is gender expression is individual, and it changes with time, and it changes with cultural understandings of what gender means in a particular cultural context. So here's another way of looking at these things collectively. So we talked about gender identity as your software. It's the way your brain is wired, right? Now we can look at sex assigned at birth in the sense of that metaphor as sex assigned at birth is your hardware, inside versus outside. So I'm a trans person. I transitioned 16 years ago in Alberta, in Canada. And so I like to say that my brain was a Mac and my body was a PC. And now that we're on the same operating system, everything connects and communicates the way that it should. Now, if you're a non-binary person or gender queer or gender dynamic, which we're going to get into in a little bit here, then you're a Linux or an Android. It means you exist outside the binary system of Mac versus PC, and you can build your gender in whatever way makes sense for you. Sorry, I was checking on the chat quickly. All right. So let's talk about gender identity. So all people in the world are either cisgendered or transgendered. You fit in one of those two categories. Now, cisgender is a Latin prefix that means on the same side of. So what this means is your sex assigned at birth and your gender identity are in alignment. If those things line up, then you are cisgendered, meaning you're not going anywhere. whereas trans is a prefix which represents the transition from one place to another. So this fundamentally represents people for whom your gender identity and your sex assigned at birth are in conflict. And that is all that is required, is that your sex assigned at birth and your gender identity is in conflict in order for you to identify as transgender. It's an umbrella term. So when we look at transgender as an umbrella term, there are two categories that we're going to talk about here. So there are binary trans people, trans men, trans women. I identify, yes, we will talk about androgyny. It's a good question. We will get to that though. So binary trans folks, so trans men and trans women. So I identify as a binary trans person. Masculinity is my comfort place, and this is where I feel comfortable and who I've always known myself to be. Now, you can also be a trans person who is non-binary, which simply means, like we mentioned earlier, that your gender identity falls outside of the categories of male and female. And so we'll look at what a variety of those presentations look like next. So within non-binary gender identities, these are examples of non-female and non-male identities that are encapsulated here. So we have gender queer. So this is a person who mixes conventional gender identities or gender signifiers while identifying as a representation of potentially both or neither. Now there's an example here of this lovely woman in the tuxedo smoking. This is Marlene Dietrich. She was an actress in the 20s and 30s in early Hollywood. And this particular representation of her, where she is in the top hat and the tux and smoking, it was illegal for women to smoke in public in the 1920s. Everything about her performance and the way that she is moving through this is genderqueer. You are seeing masculine gender signifiers with a feminine gender presentation that are being combined to queer the gendered perception of this particular person's identity. So often genderqueer people will say that it's not about abolishing gender, it's about wearing multiple aspects of gendered presentation. So another example of this would be Annie Lennox is a great example of this. There are a lot more genderqueer folks speaking about those presentations now than there used to be. Now we have gender fluid. I have a good example here of Jonathan Van Ness, who is standing down in the corner from Queer Eye, someone who talks about how their gender identity shifts from various presentations or day to day. You very likely know a gender fluid person in your world. We see a lot of them represented in pop culture, for example. And then we have agender, a person who does not identify themselves as having any particular gender identity. So they're not attached to any particular gender signifiers or mixing those things as part of a personal representation of who they are. Now, I wanted to address androgynous really quickly. So androgynous is another non-binary identity. That is entirely true. So is another non-binary identity, and it has just changed and morphed with language. So nutrios, which Matt mentioned, there are a variety of other bigender, for example. There are a couple of other versions of what this can look like. This is just an example, given our time and the context. This is an example of three pre-existing non-binary gender identities that you may see people identify with in the world. Oh, and signifier. Yeah, I can explain what a signifier is. A signifier is a piece of a gendered object or a gendered assumption that signifies masculinity or femininity. So for example, a giant truck or a hammer, for example, have often been used as references towards masculinity, whereas we often see other varieties of that, gardening and things like that. So I'm mentioning things here that are gendered in our culture that don't need to be. Anyone can garden, anyone can own a truck. But a signifier is when an object takes on an additional cultural significance, often attributed to gender. So we see that played out in the way we feel about trucks, right? And the way the assumptions we make about who drives a truck. And so that is a signifier as a reference point. Okay, so let's talk about sexual orientation. So up until this point, I've not mentioned sexual orientation because it's entirely separate. So all of us have a sexual orientation, right? They fit into a couple of different categories. When I say sexual orientation, I mean specifically who you are attracted to outside of yourself. So sexual orientation is an attraction outside of who you are attracted to externally. But it also can mean, in a lot of cases, the person that you choose to build a life with, start a family with, and contribute to community with. So this is about families as much as it is about individuals and attraction. So we'll talk about what this looks like. So here we have monosexual identities. This just simply means that you're attracted to one other gender presentation other than your own. So heterosexual, homosexual, gay, lesbian, for example, right? I am attracted to one particular gender identity outside of my own, monosexual, one. Then we have polysexual identities. So this means that you are attracted to a range or a full spectrum of gender identities outside of your own experience. So this includes identities like bisexual, pansexual, and polysexual. The single most important thing about bisexual and pansexual in this circumstance is to not fight about them on the internet. These are self-identities, and you should be comfortable applying the label that fits best with your own pattern of attraction and interests. And also, as you learn more about yourself, it's important to understand that these labels are often a placeholder for folks. They're important and they're functionally important parts of our identities, but it is not to say that somebody who is gay identified might not be bisexual later in life, or someone who identifies as pansexual earlier in life may not also identify as asexual later in life. There is a fluidity and a flexibility in what this means. Now we have ace spectrum. And the other thing I will clarify is that both monosexual identities and polysexual identities are fundamentally trans and non-binary inclusive. This is just about communicating who you are attracted to. So for example, as a trans man myself, if I was only attracted to other men, then I might identify as a gay trans man. My transition journey is my gender identity, that's who I am, and who I'm attracted to is my sexual orientation, that comes from outside of me. And so that's where those two things fit. Now we have ace spectrum identities. So these are sometimes called the aromantic or asexual spectrum, or sometimes gray sexual is a term that you will hear on the internet. So as we talked about with cisgendered and transgendered, sexual orientation also exists on a spectrum. It exists on a spectrum from a high interest in romantic and sexual connections with others. Those can be different, those can be separate entities, or a low interest in romantic and sexual connections with others. So this includes identities like asexual, aromantic, and demisexual. So what's important to understand about this is a lack of interest in sexual connections with others or romantic connections with others does not preclude ace folks from developing families and relationships and communities and participating at the same level that all of us do. It's just that they're not talked about often within and outside of the community. So I think it's important to talk about this here. So you may end up in a situation where you have someone who is gay identified, but asexual, not having sexual contacts with others, but maybe romantically attracted to other people. And when you talk harm reduction, that's going to be more about behavior than it is about those identities. So important to ask, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with folks in the gray sexual spectrum. That is something that is important and valid. All right, and then queer. So queer is a word that probably feels a little uncomfortable for some of you. So I want to make some clarifications around this. So in present day colloquialism, particularly in North America, and I want to recognize this is very different internationally, and so you should go with the terminology that the community and the place that you are uses to represent themselves. That will always be my recommendation. But in this case, let's unpack this word a bit. So queer is an umbrella term, which can be used to indicate, of course, a variety of identities underneath LGBTQ designations. So like I personally, for example, identify as queer. However, it has a really complex history in terms of what it means to different generations of LGBT people. So if you were an LGBT person seeking community in 1920, the word queer would not only have been something positive that you may have self-identified with, but it is very likely the primary identifier that early LGBT communities used to create connections right up until the beginning of about World War I. Now, as we move past World War I and World War II, we see the listing of homosexuality here in Turtle Island in North America of homosexuality as a mental disorder in a book called the DSM-3, the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual 3. This happened in 1953. And what it did is it created an open season situation where fundamentally LGBT people on the books, on paperwork now, could be fired, arrested, harassed, and institutionalized at a government and systems level. And so it's really quite important because in North America, this definition existed from 1953 to 1974, which means in 19 years, we changed an entire generation and created an LGBT rights movement that has now been in operation for 53 years. So when we say things or we think about the work that we're doing every day, we say things like a generation can change the world. it can go both ways. A single definition in a medical textbook certainly changed the world for LGBT people, but maybe not in a necessarily positive way. So I think it's important to remember that when we're working with communities and we're systematizing our responses, that often in the past has been a really difficult and complex relationship. And the rebuilding of this competency is part of our work now for a variety of reasons. But it also means that if you grew up between 1950 and about 1986, then the word queer was something being used by government institutions to arrest and harass you. And so it becomes a word that means danger and trauma. And that's legitimate because that is a valid lived experience for the social context of LGBT people at the time. Now, when you move into the 1990s and you get into present day, specifically a group that many of you might be familiar with, ACT UP, which is an acronym for the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, because we're actually quite good at naming things generally. They reclaimed the word queer as part of their AIDS and HIV activism, direct activism at the time, and they were starting to reclaim it in order to reuse it as an umbrella term for the community that was expanding rapidly and starting to look at how it could become more inclusive than moving from gay power in the gay community into the queer community and beyond. So if you're 90 in my community, you might like the word queer. If you're 65, I can almost guarantee that you hate it. You have valid reasons to hate it. And if you are 30 or younger, then you might self-identify with it, and it can be a really positive part of your identity and who you are. So this is intergenerational linguistic context, which is to say, the reason we encourage people to ask communities how they would like to be represented is because there's actually quite a bit of complex history layered on top of the words that we use for each other. All right, so speaking of which, let's talk a little bit here about Two-Spirit, Indigiqueer, and QT BIPOC, or queer, trans, Black, Indigenous people of color. Because this has come up a lot and is a very important part of the progression in the Pride movement, so I think it's important to mention. So Two-Spirit was introduced at the 3rd annual LGBT Native American gathering held in 1990 in Winnipeg. Elder Maya Laramie shared the name, and it was adopted as a spirit name. This marks the 31st year of its use. It also marks the beginning of a conversation about whether or not in 5 years from now, we will continue to use the term Two-Spirit in reference to queer identified Indigenous folks. So this is an active conversation, and I want to acknowledge that it is an active conversation in present day. But Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer, which was created by Thurza Cuthland in 2004, are both references that Indigenous folks use for themselves. The most important part about these two words is that if you are not Indigenous, and specifically in this case, we often mean Indigenous in relation to Turtle Island, in relation to the North American colonial project. But if you are not Indigenous in that context, you cannot self-identify with Two-Spirit or Indigiqueer. It is very specific to those communities and should be reserved for those communities. And what it is being used to do as an umbrella term is to reach behind the history of residential schools here, colonialism and first contact, and recover really important parts of Indigenous culture, affirming Indigenous culture that supported these identities before that first contact. It's a part of the reconciliation project we are all part of as Canadians. And so I think it's important to clarify that in this context, there's specific queer language for these communities, and the reclamation of that is their own internal cultural work, and it will shift and change over time as their awareness of themselves is shared with us. So now these three folks are personal heroes of mine, but I also think really wonderful people to introduce. So this phrase, queer, trans, Black, Indigenous people of color, is a way that we are beginning to acknowledge that the fundamental roots of the LGBT movement rest in the feminist movement, and specifically the Black civil rights movement of the 1960s and 1950s. And all of these folks are wonderful examples of that. So Stormy Delivre, who was a community organizer and drag king starting in the Harlem Renaissance in the 20s and 30s, is famous for being one of the very active participants at the Stonewall riots, which we acknowledge as one of the political actions that led to the development of LGBT community activism in North America. Absolutely worth looking up. Of course, Marsha P. Johnson, made famous by the Stonewall riots, but actually is the activist who created the first youth shelter for trans youth in a major urban city starting in 1971 with Star House. And so she is an incredible example of resilience. And in the context of our work, this conversation about where there has always been a conversation about sex work and safety and access and intersectionality and community need. And Marsha P. Johnson is a wonderful example of where those intersections have always existed in our work and will continue to. And then, of course, Bayard Rustin. He is responsible as the main architect behind an action called the Million Man March on Washington, where the I Have a Dream speech was delivered by Martin Luther King Jr. But at the time, he was a closeted gay man working in the civil rights movement, which at the time was not very accepting of LGBT identity. And so it is only recently that we've been able to celebrate him for his unbelievable amount of organizing work that very much happened in the shadows for a long time. But he is one of the reasons that LGBT activists in the 1950s and 1960s got the training they needed to start the movement we have now. So I like mentioning heroes in this context, because it's important to understand that we, as queer people, owe very much of our success and much of our work specifically to communities of color and their work. And if we don't see communities of color and Black and Indigenous folks represented at the tables of powers in our own community, then we're doing a disservice to our historical context. And so if you have questions about why Black Lives Matter started protesting at Pride, this is why. It's our responsibility as queer people to exalt and to platform these voices. It's our turn to pay them back for the work that they gave to us. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about pronouns here. And Matt really covered a great example with the tattoo shop. It is very much that these small cultural competency elements can make a significant and enormous difference in terms of how we interact with clients and how we work in our day-to-day. So let's talk about pronouns. So there are several types of pronouns. There are first person singulars, I, me, we plural, we, us, second person singular or plural, you, and then third person singular, they, them, right? Now, many of you may be familiar with using they, them if you are based in an Anglo tradition. So if you speak English as your primary language, then they, them is actually a gender neutral part of our language that's been around since about the 1600s, originally developed and used in the context of thou, used a lot by Shakespeare, for example. So if you were at a park with friends and said like, oh, and found a cell phone and said, oh, somebody dropped their phone, I wonder if they'll come back for it. You've neutralized their gender pronoun because you don't know who they are and you don't know what their gender is. But in that moment, you're not thinking consciously about their gender, you've neutralized them. Similarly, if you were to turn to your partner and say like, can you go get that thing on your knee checked out? Go to a doctor and tell me what they say, right? So when we think about where we use this, all that we're asking in the context of non-binary folks who use they, them pronouns is to shift that into a front-facing singular person experience. Now I want to invite you as a reference that it is great to take advantage of digital technology that exists in your life to build in reminders when someone in your world is changing things like names and pronouns. So perfectionism is often the enemy of good allyship. And we'll talk about allyship a little bit further along. But what that means is often folks are so afraid to make a mistake that that trans and non-binary people, for example, and often queer people in general, get refused service out of that sense of fear. So let's talk about making mistakes, because I promise you up and down 100%, you're going to make a mistake on someone's name or pronouns. It's going to happen because I can promise you that all of you have made a mistake on how you pronounce someone's name. And we're going to handle it as actually the same way. So when you make a mistake, because it happens, our brains are super fast computers. They're processing a lot of information at a time. Let's say you and I are having a conversation and you use feminine pronouns for me, you use she, her pronouns for me, and I correct you. I say, oh, I use he, him pronouns. All that's going to happen, you're going to thank me, you're going to correct your pronoun usage, say sorry, and move on. So let's go through these in pieces. So why do we say thank you? We say thank you because often when a person is correcting you on their pronouns, they're giving you the information that you need to treat them with respect. Very similar as to when we correct the pronunciation of our name with a person we've just met, right? It's not personal, it's just important that they have the correct information to address us in that way. And that can make a really big difference. Then use the correct pronoun, it's just a way of memorizing. So you'd go, thank you, he, him. Sorry about that. and then move on. Now, moving on is actually the most important part of this, because the places where trans non-binary people are often misgendered tend to be in public. They tend to be in a medical waiting room. They tend to be picking up a car at the dealership, kids from school, any place where your ID becomes the way that someone who doesn't know you refers to you. And it's important to understand that internationally, not all, in fact, very few trans and non-binary people living around the world have access to an affirming or competent medical process. And that does not invalidate their identity as a trans person because they have medical barriers to physical transition, if that is indeed what they desire. As such, name and pronouns become a piece of social context that we have control over, that you can respect us with, that allows us to have a productive relationship. So say thank you, use the right pronoun, correct yourself, and move on, and everything will be great. So it is more about how you handle the mistake than making the mistake. And then take the effort to practice. Put someone's pronouns next to their name in your contacts, in your email, or in your phone. Give yourself reminders. It's completely productive to consider that a practice of allyship is about an ongoing work relationship with your own learning. And so being a practice, it means that you will make mistakes and you will be able to increase your context, your content, overall, and learn more about the communities you're working with. So allyship is not getting it right or wrong. It's being willing to lean into an ongoing practice of learning and development. And it makes us better neighbors to each other, ultimately. All right, so let's talk about how this shows up in our work a little bit, and then I'll talk about gender roles. So often when we talk about LGBT communities in particular, people often back away from this idea that you can have a personal prejudice, right? Everybody can have a personal prejudice, my opinion, my thoughts are my own. That is not incorrect. But let's talk about what that means when we happen to be service providers in a system, in a variety of different systems. And many of you are, I'm sure, very familiar with stigma and talks around that. So this is where this comes from. So personal prejudice. Let's say that your personal prejudice is that you don't believe that same-sex couples should be legally families. That's your personal that's your personal prejudice, and that's what you believe, right? In and of itself, if you are not interacting with LGBT people, you can more or less leave that there. However, what often happens is these personal beliefs become part of public discrimination. So an example of this being you refuse to write marriage licenses to LGBT people. And in many, many countries, there's no way for LGBT people or same-sex couples in specific to get married, right? Which removes them from huge categories of legal rights that are often enshrined in the institution of marriage. Now, where this becomes public oppression is, so you meet somebody, you fall in love, you've been together for a couple of years, you decide to go, you can't get married, you decide to go on a vacation, and you get in a car accident. And suddenly your partner is 30 feet away from you in a hospital room, dying potentially. And because you are not family, they die alone. And this is something that happened a lot during the AIDS crisis to a lot of people, but in particular to LGBT people. This personal prejudice, which becomes public discrimination, which can be a lack of access or barriers, then generates itself into systemic oppression. And this is how real trauma is introduced into the system. So we as individuals, the goal of becoming culturally competent is to address specifically the ballooning of the problems where we leave people in a position to die alone without their partners because of a piece of policy. And so this becomes quite important. The other piece of this that is worth acknowledging are gender roles. So gender roles, which are different than gender expression because gender roles are societal and gender expression is individual. But gender roles are used in sociology and psychology to refer to prescribed behaviors, attitudes, and characteristics associated with one's gendered status as male, female, or non-binary. Gender roles are cultural. They change all of the time. A really good example of this in North America is if you look up Lego ads from the 1970s, they are aggressively gender neutral, which is fascinating when you look at Lego advertising now. The cultural value on kids' toys was much less gendered 50 years ago than it is now, because our societal reliance on gender roles shifts all the time. Women moving into the workplace shifted our societal gender roles. A small example of this in North America is up until about 1950, babies designated boys at birth were sent home in pink blankets, and girls were sent home in blue blankets. And that was because at the time, culturally, it was thought that pink was a strong masculine color and was associated with masculinity. And 70 years later, we now associate blue with masculinity and pink with femininity, and all of that is fluid, it changes in our lifetimes. So gender roles are specific to a culture and a person's role within that culture, and they change more often, to be honest, than we like to admit. All right. So let's talk about how we can work with LGBT populations. We're going to address what I call queer microaggressions. Now, microaggressions is a term that was developed by Chester M. Pierce at Harvard University in the 1970s, I believe 1978, specifically to address the verbal and nonverbal and systemic insults that were acted upon African Americans at the time, we would now call them Black folks, in the course of their daily lives. It was this constant reminder of racism, and measuring that is where we get microaggressions from. So queer microaggressions can show up a little differently. And because we are interacting with more LGBT people often than we ever have before, here in Canada, that's because we have federal employment protection, which started for gay, lesbian, and bisexual people in 1996, and it was finally enshrined for trans and non-binary people here in 2017, interestingly enough, on my birthday. Is neat. But it means that if you're seeing more trans and non-binary people in your world, it's probably because it's harder to fire us now, at least it is here. And that means you can take risks with your career, and that will change who is sitting at your table, right? So legislation and cultural development work hand in hand, not always well, but they always generally work hand in hand. So let's talk about microaggressions here. Oh, you know what, I want to address this really quick. So I'm not sure how to respond when I'm asked for my own pronouns. You do not have to have pronouns if you don't want to. So if your feeling is, I have no preference for pronouns, you can say that. Or you can say, my pronouns are he, she, or they. I'm happy with any of those, and that is perfectly acceptable. So if you don't have a preference, then you don't have a preference, and that's who you are. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. So you can just say, I use all pronouns, I'm completely open. And lots of people just be like, oh, okay. So I will also say, if you encounter someone who says, for example, I use he and they pronouns, what they are explicitly telling you is that you can use he masculine pronouns, he pronouns, or gender neutral pronouns, they pronouns, both are acceptable to that person. And you can mix them in conversation if you want, or use one over the other, up to you, but both are on the table. So if you are ambivalent about your own pronouns, you can just give folks that option, and that'll make it a little easier. All right, so queer microaggressions. So for example, let's start about stereotyping someone's cultural interests. Not all queer people watch RuPaul's Drag Race. Lots of queer people also like other sports. I consider Drag Race a sport. That's a whole other conversation. But, so this is important to understand that not all queer people are the five guys on Queer Eye. Not all queer people are necessarily the characters that you see on Netflix now, which is a phrase I couldn't have said 15 years ago. Queer representation on television 15 years ago, very different than it is now. So this is to say, meet LGBT people as the people that they are, not necessarily as the culture that they represent. And then what will come with them is they will introduce you to their culture over time, right? Like anybody else. Now, another thing that happens here is demanding proof of sexual orientation. This is very common on the femme end, in women's populations and femme-identified populations, is this idea that if you don't look LGBT in a specific way, it must not be true. And that is not true. LGBT people look like, come from, and have been part of every era, every culture, every gender identity and presentation that exists in human history, and we will continue to be that. So don't assume, based on how someone looks or new information you receive about them, that they're wrong. People know who they are, and if they are comfortable enough to tell you, take that at face value and believe them. All right, invading a queer or trans person's sexual and bodily privacy. So in the context of a lot of the work that you're doing, you will need to ask personal questions. But consider that you can always ask the question to yourself, is this information I actually need for this particular visit? And that can make a really big difference. It's important to understand the difference between I am curious and would like to learn more about, which is a valid feeling, but it might not always be the right place. And here's information I actually need to address your care. So one of the things that tends to happen to queer people across the spectrum, and trans people in particular, is something that we call broken arm syndrome, which means I go into a hospital with a broken arm because I fell off my bike. And 45 minutes later, or 3 hours later, depending on the wait, I have spoken to 15 medical professionals about my transition, which happened a decade and a half ago, and no one has x-rayed my arm. So consider that while LGBT identity is an important part of who many of us are, it's not the only reason, and frequently quite far away from the reason that we may be accessing your services. Lots of LGBT people access mental health services for issues that have nothing to do with their LGBT identity. So for example, lots of trans folks who are seeking additional mental health services, sometimes transition is actually the strongest, most secure part of who they are. And they need to talk about their marriage, or they need to access P&P supplies, right? So consider that while it is an important part of who we are, it's not everything about who we are. And when we're accessing service as a whole person. And then we got assuming sexuality based on gender performance, right? We associate masculinity with a particular type of sexual performance, and we have done that culturally for a period of time. It's unhelpful, and it may also lead you to making assumptions about the kind of care that someone needs, which may not line up with their actual healthcare needs. So this is where behavioral-based questions make more sense. Don't assume because of someone's gender presentation how they connect with others, because I promise you it will be all over the place. Disrespecting queer spaces. Okay, if you are a pride, consider pride exactly the same as going to a friend's birthday party. You are welcome to come to the party. Please enjoy yourself. Please eat all the food. We're thrilled to have you, but it's not your birthday. Queer space, LGBT space that is dedicated to our community and built by our community is about focusing on our needs, right? So if you're invited into that space, do your absolute best to consider that you're a guest in the space, which is true, and try not to treat queer people existing in their own worlds as a day at the zoo, which is sometimes often what happens, right? So if you're in queer space, recognize that you're a guest in the space and behave accordingly. Asking questions is perfectly fine. Getting very, 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 very drunk and hitting on people all over the bar is not. So that makes a difference. If you're doing outreach in an LGBT space or you're tabling at something like Pride, it's worth keeping that in mind. And then standing by when someone is dead named or misgendered. So I will explain dead name here. Yeah, I'm gonna make sure we have lots of time. I'll explain dead name here. So dead name is a reference that came from the trans community, specifically developed and used commonly by trans women of color. And it is referred to, sometimes legal name and dead name are spoken about interchangeably, but the phrase dead name specifically comes from your dead name is the name that the media will use to report your death. That is where it comes from. Because we see in an intersectional capacity, we see the highest rates of violence and homicide perpetrated against trans women of color, almost ubiquitously across the board, where we see the intersection of sex work that can also be an issue. And so it's really important to consider that up until now, there's been almost no media training or fair representation of trans lives. We started cataloging our own challenges in North America through an organization called the Trans Day of Remembrance, which started categorizing trans murders of people that were not being reported appropriately. So when somebody makes a reference to their dead name, means two things. It means that name is dead to them. They're a different person. They've evolved into who they are. Use their new name. That's very, very important. And it also can be a reference to the ways in which we're ignored, or in the ways in which after our deaths, our identities can be invalidated. So this is where we come around to. It is more important how you defend a trans or non-binary person when they're not in the room. It is more important that you address their pronouns and correct folks on their name and pronouns when they're not there, because that creates a much more impactful act of allyship. So don't stand by. It's okay to correct people. We will appreciate it. And then applying insensitive humor to sensitive subjects. So an easy way to think about this is in stand-up comedy, there is a concept called punching up versus punching down. Very easy. All that means is if you are about to make a joke at the expense of someone who exists outside of your lived experience, stop and consider whether or not you are punching up, meaning they are someone who is above you on the socioeconomic or social hierarchy. So for example, make all the jokes about Jeff Bezos you want. He doesn't care. we're not going to impact him in that way, right? Make fun of billionaires all that you want. But if you are, for example, a straight cisgender comedian, I would avoid making jokes at the expense of women, and I would avoid making jokes about anything related to sexual assault. That seems like practical advice, but it doesn't seem to always get through. Similarly, if you are cisgendered and you are about to make a joke at the expense of the trans community, think about whether you're punching up or punching down, and then don't. If you are punching down, don't do it. And that will give you a really good idea about whether or not this joke or this reference is appropriate. And it is important to recognize where you exist in the world in terms of privilege so that you can make a fair and accurate representation of what that means. So if you're thinking about a joke, think for a second. Am I punching up or am I punching down? Never punch down. And that will be something you can filter through lots of different circumstances. And it will help you think about that. Okay, allyship. So allyship is not fundamentally specific to the LGBT community. I think many of you probably know that. Allyship is an ongoing and conscious practice by which you participate in dismantling systemic barriers, amplifying voices of marginalized people, and advocating. Oh, that's a good question. I'll come back to that in a second. Yes, and advocating for justice. So allyship is not an identity. It's a lifelong process of building relationships based on trust and accountability and work. So allyship's not self-defined, but it also means that it's really important that we are aware of our circumstances when we're acting in allyship. So for example, as a man, it is fundamentally my responsibility to be an ally to women because I know in the society I live in that I will be invited into spaces they are not. And it's my responsibility to address and correct that. In the same way that if you are a white person, it's important that we think about whiteness as part of our identities and are willing to intervene in ways and recognize ways in which race is absolutely part of the system that we participate in. And by virtue of that, I will be invited into spaces that some people of color may not be. And it is my responsibility to make sure that they're at that table. Right? So this is where allyship becomes really important. It's about reaching into the positions of power and privilege that you occupy, largely circumstantially, and finding ways to make that a more productive and diverse workplace for all of us. All right, so here's a couple of tips, and this actually touches base on some of the questions. I want to mention punch up. So punching up is appropriate because if you are making jokes at the expense of someone who is on a higher part of the socioeconomic ladder than you, then you are not increasing the barriers and violence that that person faces on a day-to-day basis. When you vilify or adopt insensitive humor, for example, for the trans community who has a heck of a time accessing healthcare, often by disproportionately lives in poverty, this community is not a community that needs any more sort of social complication or any more barriers introduced into the general population. So it's about making a choice about what you want to put out in the world. And that is where punching up versus punching down can make a big difference. Okay, we have lots of questions coming in. This is a lot of fun, everybody. I'm really glad that this has been great. So I'm gonna run through this and then we'll move right into Q&A, which should put us right on time. So working on it. So GSD is a reference that you have seen me make, gender and sexually diverse. This is a way of referencing the entire community without picking through the acronym, and it is a reference that government institutions and funders are starting to pick up, and pride organizations are also starting to pick up. So I put it here just as an option, so you can use GSD. It covers all of us, and it is a short way to make that reference. I do think that adding pronouns to your email signature makes a difference. When cisgendered folks introduce their pronouns into the world, so if you start a meeting as a leader, you say, I would say, like, my name is James, my pronouns are he and him. When you introduce that into the world, it means that trans and non-binary folks don't have to be the only ones to identify. And then it means that they don't have to start that meeting by outing themselves. And that really makes a big difference. Considering gender neutral greetings for events. So honored guests, welcome everyone. Hey folks, I've grown up in the prairies, so hey y'all happens every once in a while, but not very often if I can help it. So consider that we can change our language in small ways, and often getting more formal can be great. People love being spoken to formally, so that can make a difference. Gender titles are not always necessary in our form work, but if they must be used, it's ideal to add a non-binary option like MX, which is pronounced mix, which can go along with Mr., Mrs., and Mrs. And then the pronoun they, as we've mentioned, is especially useful when someone's gender identity is unknown. However, don't use this as an excuse to not ask. It's really, the idea is that you have the opportunity to ask in the short term. Then they can be completely useful, but we want ultimately to be specific. Our goal here, particularly in the context of harm reduction in this work, is not to invisibilize our differences. It's about finding ways to celebrate them. So talking about race, talking about gender, asking these questions, it prevents us from defaulting into an assimilation type of system and allows us to meet the patient where they're at because we're looking at them as a whole person as often as we can. Okay, that covers my piece. Let's bring Matt back on, and we've got a whole bunch of questions. I will start sort of plugging through these pieces, and I will give us a little more screen space. But otherwise, I want to thank you all for the time, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we're about to have. Okay, we've got a couple. Hey, Matt, how's it going?
I'm good, thanks. Super informative. Even I felt I learned something. Well, there's always so much to learn, but yes. Yeah, I think Shay wanted to jump in at this point because there was some and results from the poll. I think we want to do that before we dive into questions. Shay, is that correct?
That's totally correct. And thanks for reminding me because I was about to tell everybody a fun story. So here are the results from the poll. You should be able to scroll through it. You can see that there's 37% of the people who answered that question are from, so that looks like the population is pretty consistent with the amount of people in Canada. I'm excited to see the great folks from Quebec. I will note that there was a great conversation about question number 3. Specifically, we made this a single choice question, and we've got feedback from 2 people that that's not okay. So we'll change it to multi-choice for the next time. You can direct message me if you had to pick one, because Shay was mean-spirited. If you had to pick one and you wanted to pick 2 or 3 or 7, just direct message me or email me and I'll fix the data when I pull it out of Zoom, and I will add those pieces to you because I understand you want to be recognized. And I didn't mean to censor you at all. I'm sorry about that. You can see that there's a bunch of folks who are English and French speaking, which is exciting. And I have to say hello to whoever is in police and law enforcement. You are our official first representative of that community in any of our online events. So thanks for joining us, everybody. And that's your poll. Have a good day.
So we had a couple of questions here. I can address the pronoun piece. So in the US, people are dropping the 3rd pronoun. So sometimes you'll see people identify and they'll say, I use he, him, his pronouns as opposed to he, him. Either is fine. I think she, her, hers would make a great punk band name, but other than that, you can pick either. So, but yeah, that's perfectly fine. It's not culturally specific. It's just efficient, basically. Yes, and I did mean aromantic. You're right.
I was going to point that out when the call was over. One of the questions that has the highest upvotes is the question around the language. So T and spill the T is part of African American vernacular English. So one of the things, so I wasn't around when Spill the T's branding was created, so I can't necessarily speak to who was in the community consultation. That was anonymous. They kept no records. So I don't necessarily know if there were Black folks in the community consultation. That being said, what I did know was that the person who was running the community consultations, like who was the Max staff in charge, is a Black gay man. So, and because Max at the end of the day had the final say as to what we were naming it, and the consultation was to help find a name, I would like to think that if there was a big concern, we would have not gone that direction. But as I said, I cannot speak to what the demographic was of the community consultation that happened. because the community consultation that happened when Spill the Tea was created led to the Safer Party Advisory Committee, but not everybody who was in the original consultation carried through. Some people just wanted to be in that initial part, and then they didn't want to stay on as part of the Safer Party Advisory Committee. So I don't, as I said, I don't have any records, and I have no way of knowing what was who was involved in the original branding idea, other than the Max staff that was involved. So I'm sorry, I can't speak more to that. The most I can say is that I do know that there is spill the tea, and a lot of these originally African American vernacular English have been adopted over the years by the queer community at large. And I think that's where the idea had come from, to use the term spill the tea, because tea had multiple meanings in queer culture and in substance use culture and the P&P culture. So I think that's where that had come from. Yeah, I see there's a question between adopted or appropriated. And yeah, I mean, I don't think I have the default decision-making as to whether or not that was adopted or appropriated, because it could be either. Because as much as you would want to say that it was done respectfully, I can't say that it was in good faith. I don't know that. Well, so technically I'm the person who runs the Spill the Tea program. So I can put my email in, and you're welcome to email me with any concerns that you have. I'll put my email address right there.
And I'll touch base on this. So I had a question. A couple of colleagues who introduced themselves as they, them, in addition to she, her, for example, in their email signature to normalize they, them pronouns. The air quotes are part of the question, not me. Is this approach normalizing they, them pronouns appropriate and supportive? It's a good question, because my response as a trans person would be, if you don't identify as a non-binary person, then I wouldn't use non-binary pronouns. It is very common for trans and non-binary folks, when they are starting to transition, to potentially dip a toe into non-binary identity and then move through the transition process. It also takes quite a long time. So it's not uncommon for that to happen in those contexts. But if you don't identify with those pronouns, I'm not sure that it's helpful necessarily, so much as it creates probably a little bit more confusion. Now, having said that, it's entirely reasonable that you will experience colleagues who change their pronouns while you're working with them, and there may be a period of time, there may be a transitionary time where that is happening, and we should have space for that. But yes, so in the same way that I have had well-intentioned folks who identify as allies say, for example, I went to an LGBT youth camp, which is a great initiative, and there are several of them across the country. And they said, we're going to use nothing but gender neutral pronouns at camp, which you'd think would be great, except that not everyone identifies with gender neutral pronouns. And so that can be a problem, right? Because if you use they, them for someone instead of he or she, that is still misgendering them. So it's not about eliminating gender. It's just about being specific and using the appropriate pronouns for the appropriate person. But if you are cisgendered identified, you are not in a and I also want to say, questioning is a valid identity. Not knowing and being in an exploratory place is a human thing that all of us should be granted access to. Questioning is an important part of the acronym. So it's okay to be in that process. That is perfectly fine. But if you're not trans-identified, you're not leaning into that questioning space, then I would let trans and non-binary people use those for the reasons they do. Oh yeah, and we have the acronym here, SGM, sexual and gender minorities. So it works. We're in this process of figuring out what the language means. We're also in this process of having a really honest conversation about, should the two S go first? How are we including Indigenous folks in this conversation in a non-colonial way? And that can be really very important to those communities. So it's in flex. SGM, GSD, I've seen both of them used in different places, but I can say that currently there is no community-wide consensus on how that is working. It's going to be different a little bit region from region as it evolves. And honestly, for the safety of folks in some international communities, you may want to use something entirely different, which is also okay, right? It's about your context. So in the same way that pride should look different all over the world, the way that you work with LGBT clients will probably look different in each of your individual contexts, and that's okay. That's part of cultural competency.
I think there's another question about pushback. Question about dealing with pushback when people do not feel comfortable doing a survey or questionnaire. I mean, we don't have surveys or questionnaires as required for accessing our programs, so they're given after materials are given out or after support groups are finished. And then the idea is that they have the decision-making power to choose to fill it out or not. We get roughly between 20 to 25% of participants that fill out surveys. So we don't get like a full scope of every single person that accesses, but that's how we've been able to kind of balance that, because we don't force it. So if somebody pushes back and says they don't want to do it, our stance has just been, okay, like we don't require it necessarily. I know that that's not necessarily the case everywhere. For some places you are required to fill out forms in advance. I'm not really sure what to suggest in that case, because it's if somebody doesn't feel comfortable leaving information, they likely will just go somewhere else or not access service at all. It's one of the issues that we've had in Ottawa. We have a drug testing facility, but I believe the drug testing facility here requires you to sign in to get your drugs tested, and that's like a big barrier. So they're having far less people getting their drugs tested as a result of that. So I wonder at that point if it's like going back to the origin of like why this is required in advance, and see if there's room to move on that, because we get quite a few people that still give us survey data and give us information, fill out questionnaires and stuff, but it's only because we give them the option to, and we do it after we provided services. It's not, they don't get what they need if they fill out the survey. They get what they need and then they fill out the survey.
And I'll mention that somebody sent a question saying another stereotype is the kind of politics that queer people should or should not have. And that's really complicated. And by and large, so one of the things I want to clarify here, LGBT identity is not inherently political, in the same way that being Black or Indigenous is not inherently political. We politicize difference. So for example, trans people have been being next to you in washrooms for literally thousands of years, right? The current politicizing bathrooms in the last 10 years has made trans people's access to public space more dangerous, because our identities have been politicized for no reason other than a lack of understanding about our lives, right? So this is the other thing, is inherently being an LGBT person is not a political stance. It has come with a history and a movement that is attached to achieving rights and eliminating barriers in our world that is part of who we are. But anyone can be queer, which means anyone can have any political beliefs they would like and still be attracted to, right, anyone else. And so in the same way, queerness is not inherently a political identity, it's a self-identity, which is to say that LGBT people can have any political beliefs that they would like to have. And there's a lot of diversity within the community in that context. However, it is not uncommon that communities will pull together in order to accomplish something, right? So for example, I would say I've had to do as much trans and non-binary education in my own community as outside of it. Right? I like to say we don't get a definitions list with the membership card when we come out. That's not how that works. And so all of us also have to learn about who we are, and that comes with a variety of different perspectives. But we are trying to move away from this idea that being able to identify as who you are is inherently political, because for some of us, absolutely it is, but that's an additional part of who we are. Being able to identify and access barrier-free service is just a right that all human beings should have. So there's a fundamental difference between political queerness and queerness, and they don't necessarily have to agree. So for example, here's a really good example. I'm not a big fan of Caitlyn Jenner's politics, but I will not dead name or misgender her, because that's disrespectful. And her trans identity and the person that she is something I can respect, even though I disagree with her politics. So for example, it's a really bad idea to invalidate someone's identity just because you disagree with them, those are two separate things. You can validate someone's trans identity and disagree with them politically without attacking who they are as a person. And that is fine, right? That is how we have these conversations, but that is a difference, I think a distinction that's important.
Did we do the one with the signifiers? Did you look
No, we can
at
talk
that
about
one?
Yeah, so you are correct. Gendered signifiers, because they're culturally created, they are part of gender expression. Whereas gender identity is who you are. Identity is personal, it's individual. Expression is how other people see you express your gender. So gender presentation and gender expression are similar. We can use those interchangeably, but gender identity is individual and it's internal. So that's the major difference. So yeah, gendered signifiers are part of gender expression. They're ways that we show our gender to others, basically. Yeah, so that is entirely correct. So there is a difference between the two. Identity is internal, expression and presentation are external. They're based on cultural reading of gender and what that means. Oh, Matt, we both might have some piece for this. Queer-led media outlets.
I mean, in Canada, we have OTV Go or OTV. There's Pink Triangle News. I believe Extra is still up and running. I know that they don't have printed newspapers anymore in Ottawa, but I believe the website is still up and running for other parts. Yeah. I'm trying to think of who else I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, in North America, in terms of internet, there's also Autostraddle, which is great. They have really great articles. They're definitely on the lesbian and women identified women end of that spectrum, but they have great stuff, and I've always found their content really strong. And then there are a variety of sort of organizations and resources outside of that. I think between Canada and the United States. There's a great website called mykidisgay.com, which is about helping parents when their kids come out. There's a couple of books and some amazing programming that's attached to supporting LGBT youth. There's counseling services. It's a really, really great resource, particularly for parents and families. So I've always found that a really productive place to send folks as well. In terms of general support, and it's harder to find queer parent support and sometimes queer youth support. So GSAs and school divisions are often a place to go for that. But yeah, My Kid is Gay is a great place to start, and that can make a big difference. Yeah, TV Go on there. Okay, yeah, we've got a whole bunch popping in here, which is great. And then the other piece of it is, I would say, be critical of queer representation wherever you see it in media. It's okay to love something and also be critical of the storytelling that it presents, right? And I would say we have more LGBT representation in media than we've ever had. That does not mean we have good or dynamic or three-dimensional representation in media for LGBT people. Those are really different things. It is starting to change, but it's really only started to change in the last couple of years. Yeah, so sex as a legal category in Canada is the same across the country right now. So birth certificates are federal documentation, so it should be the same in Quebec that it is in the rest of the country in terms of sex as a legal category currently. If that changes, it will change federally. That court case is being fought by a trans youth and their parents from Saskatchewan right now. So it's in process. When I say in the next 10 years, it's just because I have little faith that the courts will move faster than that, but it is actually a case that's being fought right now, and it's coming from the prairies. So, so that might change in time. Oh, gender noise. Oh, yes. Oh, that is a good question, actually. I actually don't know. Maybe I'm getting too old. Maybe that is finally happening. I don't want to take a shot at it in case I'm wrong, but to be honest, gender noise is a little bit new for me. That sounds like a line that's in line with sort of like abolishing gender or removing gender, which is certainly popular amongst young queer kids in particular. But Matt, do you have a reference here?
For gender noise? No, I don't believe I do.
Well, now I'm going to find out, and I will send the information to Shay so you can all get it, because now I need to know.
Sorry, I was reading. There was a comment to talking about how not everyone has the privilege to express their gender in a way that aligns with their identity, and that's very true. And I mean, you'll even have instances where somebody who identifies as non-binary may, by like stereotypically present, or their expression is interpreted as like either masculine or feminine, and people will default to using those, not realizing that they identify as non-binary. So it turns into this situation where that person then feels like they don't express non-binary enough because they get misgendered a lot. So that's one of the reasons why giving the space for self-identification is so important, and like asking for pronouns, because just because someone has a beard doesn't mean that they identify as male, or it doesn't mean that they identify with masculine pronouns, because you can definitely have like that may be a signifier or something that people have as part of their expression that people interpret as masculine, but non-binary people can have facial hair or body hair or something that's associated with like a masculine trait, or they could have long hair and painted nails, which is often associated with feminine characteristics, and be non-binary. So there's no requirement on a non-binary person's part to express in a way that everyone will interpret as non-binary. That's not a requirement. So that's why it's like really good to ask pronouns, because we can't always leave it up to our interpretations of gender expression to identify if somebody's non-binary. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not seeing any more questions pop up.
I just pop up. There's a note about Quebec and about gender defiers, because Quebec has different civil code than the rest of Canada. They're sort of an exception, so we may have to check to see what their rules are. Nick, who's our translator or simultaneous interpreter, is the one who mentioned it. I was all like, oh yeah, it's possible. It's a bit different. Sometimes they're behind, sometimes they're ahead. But I just thought, oh, we should check.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry to pop in. One of the questions I got from the chat, which was a bit while ago, was, what the heck is the second part of this? So because I've already interrupted, I've decided to like commit to interrupting, which is so some background. The plan was to always do a stimulus connect, specifically related to party and play, and to actual, like sort of a more extensive conversation about harm reduction within the queer community. But there was also a note like, I need more information about hormone replacement therapy, tips and needles and pieces. So we may need to do more than one, or do a specialized piece just around hormone replacement therapy, harm reduction. The same way I think, and this is a bit off topic, but I think we also probably need to do something around steroids and harm reduction, because that's a very specific piece. And certainly steroids in Nova Scotia may be a different thing than what I've experienced steroids in Alberta. So I'm going to ask folks to write into the chat, what are some pieces you want us to talk more deeply on at the next event or events? We're going to save the chat, so we'll have it. And then Maticus and James, if you have things you think based on today's things and our previous conversations, you can actually just tell us, and because this is a recording, we'll have it as well. And sorry to interrupt.
No. I mean, I'll defer to Matt on this because of his experience. But I mean, my feeling is we haven't had a chance to talk about LGBT seniors populations or newcomers, and those are two really important populations to consider in terms of access to services. There's a lot of crossover there, and there's a lot of cultural considerations linguistically, but also logistically, particularly with LGBT newcomers and their safety. That's a whole other conversation which deserves its own attention. Yeah. So from my end, but Matt, go for it. What do you think?
I mean, I think there's also going to be a thing. One of the big issues that we have with newcomers, especially coming into contact with P&P, with queer sexualized substance use, and not having, it's not often a thing that's talked about when newcomers access service in harm reduction settings for a lot too. And that's where it's like they can get into situations where they don't understand what is being asked of them if they're being invited over to party or to do things like that. So translating party and play culture is a big part, like just like general party and play information. I'd say that's a big one. And I think the other thing too is like if we're going to go into this conversation more intersectional concerns with like QT BIPOC folks and Indigenous folks when it comes to harm reduction, because there's also different concerns that come up when we're dealing with folks who are facing other types and intersectional oppression on top of accessing harm reduction. So it's it's a little bit more. I think that would be one that would be really interesting to have, because then there is more considerations that need to be taken into account.
Yeah, and I agree. There was a mention in the chat here of more BIPOC representation. Yeah, we agree. We agree entirely on that, and I think that that's especially important because there is, again, it's another layer of cultural competency, right? And we should be able to develop leadership from that perspective. I got a clarification on gender noise. I know it is dysphoria. That's where I was confused. Yes, I completely understand what you're talking about now. So gender noise, which we sometimes call, or which traditionally, like I would call as a trans person, gender dysphoria or gender euphoria, is gender noise. That's exactly what you're talking about. So yes, I can address that. So gender dysphoria is the overwhelming feeling, but also sort of physical manifestation of stress and anxiety, and this overwhelming feeling that something is wrong. And so gender dysphoria is the way that many trans kids and adults acknowledge that something about living in the body, the way that they are moving through the world, it feels like it's something that's been jammed in a space that doesn't fit, right? It's uncomfortable. You can think about it like having sand in your shoes or having pins and needles. You can't ignore it, and it's constant. And so it is often the catalyst that dysphoria is often the catalyst that drives trans folks towards the desire to either transition or gender dysphoria often drives young or not well-resourced trans folks to things like suicide attempts. It's really very much kind of one of those categories. So yes, what the kids you're working with are experiencing gender noise, which is actually gender noise, now that I'm thinking about it in context, is actually a really good way to describe euphoria, because it is like having a white noise machine on in your brain all the time. It's this constant noise in the background that wears away at your sense of self. It wears away at things like your self-confidence. That's very real. And so for teenagers, particularly if you're working with youth, this can be especially sharp because they're all lots of the cisgender teenagers around them are discovering their gender identities. We just call it puberty, but same idea, right? And they're moving in a different direction than the trans youth around them. We're sharpening the lines that cut up gender societally, right? And that can get much, much worse as they get older. And trans youth are also, if they're going through puberty and they don't have supportive parents and they're not on hormone blockers, for example, then if they're self-aware that their body is going in the opposite direction from how they feel, that compounds that feeling, right? It's especially isolating. So yeah, gender noise is actually a really good metaphor for what that feels like. And it does create isolation, and that actually makes a lot of sense. So yeah, so it is the understanding that something is wrong, no one else can see it, no one believes me, and I know that it's true. And the opposite of that is gender euphoria. This is when we all get dressed to go on a date and are like, I look good, right? It's this when we are in ourselves and present in our world, in the ways that we move through the world, and that lines up, and it's euphoric. You feel good. And often with trans populations, we only talk about dysphoria. We only talk about how hard it is. And I think there's real value, especially when you're working with young people, to find the places in their world where they are gender euphoric. That could be a dance program, that could be a shopping experience, that could be a haircut. But introducing them to places in the world where they can access gender euphoria is actually one of the best ways to address things like dysphoria. So if we focus only on how you feel bad, we never get to celebrate what makes us feel good. And that, it makes a world of difference for, I think, all of us, honestly. All people have a gender, it's yours. No one can tell you what to do with it. You deserve to have ownership over it, and we can provide that for teenagers as well. But yeah, dysphoria is what you're talking about there. Eddie, if I knew how to do that for all the trans people in your life, I'd have a totally different career. So the dialogue between trans folks regarding their transition. So here's the thing that's important to understand for when we're getting tight on time. So I'll let this go and we can swap over. The important thing to understand about most folks who choose to medically transition, if they're in a country and a culture where they're allowed to access that, that's a big caveat. It's like 24 countries in the world, right? It's very, very small. So the important thing to understand is for most people, a transition process is somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 10 years of their life, right? And so it's going to be a period of time. It's not, Hollywood makes it look like, double clap and I come back and I'm done. And that's not how it works at all in real life. And that's not how it's going to work with the trans people in your life. So this means that their emotional and psychological and spiritual transition are going to happen at different rates. Like you may have access to medical transition and not have time for your social transition learning to catch up with you, right? So it's important to provide space for someone to figure out what this means. Assume they're in a questioning place, right? And particularly at the beginning of the transition, they're also putting themselves often in a lot of public danger because they are a visible trans person in the world. So if your friend is less enthusiastic about going out to a bar to meet up with you after work because they've just started transitioning, it may be because they don't feel like getting harassed by strangers that day. And supporting them might be, let's hang out at your house today. But it's also really, if you have a friend who is transitioning and only isolates themselves, get them out of the house. It's really important for all of our mental health, right? To find that balance. So allow them to have space. It's going to take time. Be there for them, meet them where they're at. But very, very quickly, you start to see, once you get into that place and you start to find yourself, that euphoria drives many things from there on out. And so you're going to see a change. For many parents that I've worked with trans children, the difference between their suicidal and depressed child and their happy and thriving child makes their transness irrelevant. It's just a way that they are living in the world, and that euphoria becomes really powerful. So yeah, hang on, it's a journey. Stick it out with them. Be prepared for things to shift and change because we're human beings. We're supposed to change, right? That's the whole point. All of us. So yeah, stick with them. It will take time. And you asking this question means you're in the right place already, to be honest.
So we have a couple last minute things. Maticus, do you want to lead off? Do you want me to lead off?
I think I have a couple. Yeah, I think I have a couple lines left. I gotta say. Yeah, I just want to end up with thanking everyone for their engagement today, and given how much time we all seem to be spending online these days. And at the end of the event, you'll be invited to fill out a 1-minute survey. Thank you in advance for your feedback. And today's recording will go up on the Stimulus website soon.
And all of the gazillion references and resources you mentioned in this room. So part of it be like, oh, please, like it's going to probably double. So I'm really excited about that. I want to especially thank Maticus and James for all of the work. They came through and hooked us up on this amazing presentation, which is going to lead to a lot of different new great things. And I'm going to ask that tech team to come back as I thank them. Thanks to Nick for your simultaneous interpretation. I'm pretty sure the reason why the Francophones couldn't hear you at the beginning was actually something I did. I'll explain it, and I promise to never do this again. Shay, Courtney, oh, I'm Shay. Courtney, can you tell I'm reading? Courtney and Emery, thanks for wrangling the chat and the Q&A. For those of you who didn't notice, Anne-Marie actually went out into the other room and translated on the fly all the questions into French so that the Francophones would be able to understand what was going to come up next as questions and upvote correctly. I want to take this moment to really center us back into going back into our day and really recognize that it's important to honor and rededicate our work to the ones we've lost to the toxic drug supply and the war on drugs. This is a hard time for all of us, and it's really important we take the time to remember those folks. So we're going to have some moments of silence. Thanks for joining us in this. Thank you, everyone. The tech and panelists are going to stay here for a little bit, and if you don't leave in a few minutes when we're done, we're going to have to kick you out. But we have 2 minutes, so I'm going to send it back to James and Maticus. Any last comments? We're here, we're queer, get used to it.
That's always a good one.
It's an old one.
I mean, I stand by what I said. It's easy to respect somebody, and harm reduction is about respecting autonomy, the autonomy for someone to choose how they want to live and how they want to work and how they want to express themselves. And if we're living by harm reduction principles, then we will respect their pronouns and their gender identity and their sexuality, because we already want to leave them autonomous for all the other decisions of their lives. So why would we clamp down on something that seems counterintuitive to harm reduction?
I just want to say thank you. I am new to my work with Max, not new to this work in the context of queer activism, but it was a really wonderful experience to be here in front of an international audience and know that there are so many other people in the world that are making it a better place. There is great solidarity in doing this work together, and I'm honored to be part of it. So thank you for making space for this today. I have grown up as an activist in a world where nobody wanted to talk about trans people when I started. And so I'd acknowledge the enormous shift that has happened. It's saved my friends' lives, and it will continue to. And all of you are in the business of saving lives every day. So I feel honored to be here, and I want to thank you for sharing the space.
Gonna do it.